What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Nerdy Professor podcast, where we talk about everything black, bold, and beautiful. Today, we'll be taking a little trip to Jamaica. Yay! Here we will be discussing the Jamaican Maroons, their efforts against the British, and their forced migration to Nova Scotia. First things first, I'm going to be using the word maroon a lot, so let me give you a quick summary. The word maroon comes from the Spanish word cimarron, meaning wild, unruly, or runaway. Cimarron eventually made its way to the English language, where it just became maroon. Maroon isn't just referring to one group of people, it refers to any runaway slave community in the New World. Also, before we jump into the history, let's talk about some anime. The story of the Jamaican Maroons reminds me of this really obscure but popular anime named Golden Kamuy. Golden Kamuy is an action-packed full historical anime set in the early 20th century following the Russian-Japanese War. In Golden Kamuy, we follow the immortal Sachi Sugimoto, a battle-hardened war veteran, and Asirpa. Asirpa is an Ainu girl who has lost her father and now seeks revenge while protecting her people's legacy. She and Sachi team up to embark on a treasure hunt. So every good treasure hunt has a map, but this map is tattooed on the bodies of escaped prisoners. I want to focus particularly on Asirpa. Her story is about survival in the wilds of Hokkaido. It's also about keeping her cultural identity alive amidst a world that seeks to erase it. For those who don't know, the Ainu people are an indigenous group of people in Japan, and the anime does a great job of capturing their culture. Also, like most indigenous people, the Ainu, like the Jamaican Maroons, have a long history of resistance against colonization and marginalization. Asirpa's journey is about reclaiming what is rightfully hers, the knowledge of her people, the traditions they fought to preserve, and their very way of life. Much like the Maroons who fought for their land and heritage in Jamaica, Asirpa's fight is not just one for survival, but for the future of her people. The series blends action, survival, and historical elements with themes of loyalty, greed, and survival. The show is very good, but the humor is different, and it'll make or break the show for you if you make it past there. When we think about the Maroons and their relocation to Nova Scotia, we see them in a similar fight, one for cultural survival. The Maroons fought to preserve what they brought with them from Africa and in Nova Scotia. They were thrust into a new world where their traditions, language, and ways of life had to be protected against erasure. Asirpa's resilience in Golden Kamuy parallels the Maroons' determination to resist not only the cold, but the coldness of cultural assimilation. Alright, so y'all might be thinking that Nova Scotia isn't Jamaica. Nerdy Professor, you said that we were going to Jamaica. Alright, so I'm gonna take y'all to Jamaica to tell you how the Maroons made it to Nova Scotia. The history of the Jamaican Maroons is rooted in survival, strength, and autonomy against overwhelming odds. The first Maroon War began in the early 1700s. Central to this story is the expansion of British settlements. As sugar plantations grew across Jamaica, they began to encroach on Maroon territories, sparking increased tensions. The Maroons, who had established autonomous communities in the island's rugged interior, found themselves in conflict with the colonial settlers who sought to expand their control. This friction was further exacerbated by colonial aggression. Planters, in their drive for profits, treated the Maroons with unreasonable hostility, viewing them as a threat to the stability of the plantation economy. The Maroons in turn responded with raids, plundering, and pillaging their estates. These attacks not only disrupted the plantation's economy, but also instilled fear in the hearts of the colonists, raising anxieties of a wider, more organized uprising. They were determined to eradicate the Maroon communities, which they viewed as a symbol of defiance and a threat to their colonial aspirations. This desire for control was tied to the broader context of previous slave revolts. From 1694 to 1704, a series of revolts had resulted in an increasing number of enslaved people fleeing to the Maroons, swelling their ranks and making their communities even more resistant to British authority. At the heart of the conflict was the Maroons' desire for autonomy. They sought to maintain their independence from the colonial system, living freely in the mountains, far from the plantations and their oppressors. This directly conflicted with the British, whose interests were tied to controlling the entire island and its enslaved workforce. Additionally, the Maroons' very existence disrupted the plantation economy. As Maroon communities grew, they freed more enslaved people, destroyed property, and undermined the system that relied on slave labor. So the First Maroon War took place for over a decade. The Maroons' story begins in the forest of Jamaica, where enslaved Africans escaped from the plantations to form free communities. These escaped enslaved people hid in the jungle and fought back using guerrilla tactics. Guerrilla tactics are basically sabotaging and ambushing larger militaries with a smaller, more tactical force. At the heart of this fierce First Maroon War was a figure whose name would become synonymous with strength, resilience, and leadership. One of Jamaica's national heroes, the lady on the $500 note, the Jamaican ninja herself, Nanny of the Maroons. She was born around 1686 in what is now Ghana. Nanny's name has echoed through generations as a symbol of resistance, strength, and leadership. Her story is filled with military triumph and also the supernatural, the stuff of legends. As the leader of the Windward Maroons in eastern Jamaica, Nanny was at the forefront of the First Jamaican War. Nanny was no mere figurehead, she was a military mastermind, leading her people in guerrilla warfare against the British with unparalleled skill. Nanny used her deep knowledge of Jamaica's rugged terrain to lead her people in guerrilla warfare. She'd lead surprise attacks, disappearing into the dense jungles and reappearing with devastating force when the British least expected it. Time and time again, her forces inflicted significant losses on the British, exposing the vulnerabilities of colonial power and proving that the Maroons would not be easily subdued. But Nanny was also a community builder. She established and led Nannytown, a settlement deep in the Blue Mountains that became a fortress for runaway enslaved people. Nannytown was a physical stronghold. It was a symbol of the Maroons' autonomy, a place where people could live free from the tyranny of their colonial oppressors. It was here, amidst the fires and murmurs of the gathering, that Nanny's leadership would inspire nearly 1,000 enslaved people to escape and join the Maroons. It was also around these campfires and gatherings that the legend of Nanny grew. The Maroons believed in supernatural forces, and Nanny's own legendary status was fueled by the belief that she was guided by spiritual powers. She was said to possess the incredible ability to catch bullets and redirect them back at the enemies. There were stories of her magic pot that would continuously boil, and the miraculous pumpkin seeds that fed her people during sieges only added to her mystique. Also, some believed that Nanny received divinely inspired dreams that would help them during battles. But whether fact or fiction, these legends made Nanny a symbol of hope for her people. Whether or not you believe in the supernatural powers attributed to Nanny, one thing is clear. Under her leadership, the Maroons won. The British were unable to fully conquer them, and eventually they reached a treaty in 1739, granting the Maroons autonomy in exchange for peace. This treaty granted them freedom and land, an incredibly rare concession in British colonial history. Nanny of the Maroons was one of the great military leaders in the First Jamaican Maroon War. She was a beacon of hope, a figure whose courage and strength and ingenuity have made her a legend in Jamaican history. Her story, told through song, folklore, and oral tradition, continues to inspire not just Maroons, but also those who resist oppression. But no. The story of the Jamaican Maroons and their fight against the British doesn't stop there. The Second Maroon War popped off 56 years later because of a few reasons. Okay, so first, the storm of revolution was brewing across the Caribbean, with the French Revolution shaking Europe and a slave revolt erupting in nearby Haiti. British planters, already on edge, began to fear that the revolutionary spirit might spread to their own enslaved population. By this time, the Nannytown Maroons, who had long lived in uneasy peace with the British, were becoming restless. Their agreement earlier with the colonial authorities, the 1739 treaty, was no longer seen as a fair deal. What was once a promise of autonomy and land had turned into growing dissatisfaction. Maroon communities felt increasingly sidelined, particularly as more and more white settlers moved into their lands, edging closer to their territories. One of the most pressing grievances was the ever-expanding sugar plantations onto Maroon lands, which threatened their traditional territories. As plantations spread, so too did the British attempt to restrict Maroon activities like their ability to hunt and farm, which were essential for survival. Territorial boundaries became a constant sore spot, with the Maroons pushing back against British control over the land they had fought so hard to protect. There were also disagreements over the British appointed officials to the Maroon towns, which undermined the Maroons' sense of self-governance and autonomy. But the immediate spark that lit gasoline-soaked match, the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will, was the public flogging of 2 Maroons from Trelawney Town for allegedly stealing pigs. This punishment particularly pissed off the Maroons because it was administered by a black overseer from the Negro prison. This is an act that struck at the very core of the Maroon sense of dignity and autonomy. This injustice sparked outrage among the Trelawney Town Maroons and their leaders like Montague James. Montague James quickly demanded a meeting with the British authorities to air their grievances, but the meeting did not go as they had hoped. The British authorities under Governor Alexander Lindsay, 6th Earl of Balcarres, dismissed their concerns and instead had the Maroon leaders in prison. Balcarres, influenced by the revolutionary fervor sweeping through the French Caribbean, mistakenly believed that the Maroons had been influenced by the French revolutionaries. He feared that they too would rise up, inspired by the same revolutionary spirit. Balcarres' response was swift and harsh. He ordered Colonel William Fitch and his forces to march to Trelawney Town, demanding the immediate submission of the Maroons. But what Balcarres didn't anticipate was the role that Montague James would play in turning the tide. Initially captured, James was released by the British, seemingly to convince his people to surrender. But instead of yielding, James took this opportunity to reveal the mistreatment he had suffered at the hands of the British. His message to the Maroon warriors was clear. They had been wrong, and the time had come to resist once again. This was the tipping point. What had started as a series of grievances now escalated into a full-blown rebellion. In mid-August, the Maroons of Trelawney Town, led by James and several other leaders, rose up against the British. What followed was a campaign of guerrilla warfare in the dense mountainous terrain of Cockpit country, where the Maroons had a deep knowledge of the land. They would strike swiftly and disappear into the jungle, much like many of the Maroons, leaving the British soldiers frustrated and demoralized. This marked the end of 5 decades of relatively peaceful coexistence between the British planters and the Maroon communities. The Maroons were no longer willing to submit, and the British were determined to crush what they saw as a growing threat. What could have been a minor dispute, one that might have been resolved through negotiation, quickly spiraled into an all-out conflict, setting the stage for the Second Maroon War. As the war raged on, it became clear that this was no longer just a fight over land or power. The Maroons' resistance was deeply rooted in their desire to preserve their independence, to protect their way of life, and to stand against the ever-expanding control of the British Empire. The war would drag on for 8 months, eventually leading to a peace treaty in 1796. The British, eager to reassert control, decided to relocate the Maroons to Nova Scotia. The Maroons, proud and independent, were now strangers in a land. The promises of the British would soon feel empty, and the Maroons would find themselves fighting new battles, not with the British, but with survival itself. For the Maroons, arriving in Nova Scotia wasn't a new beginning. It was a bitter continuation of their fight. Upon their arrival in Nova Scotia, the Jamaican Maroons found themselves in a land far removed from the tropical climate and familiar crops they had known. The cold was only the beginning. They had to battle isolation, discrimination, and a society that viewed them as outsiders. The promise of freedom was tainted by the stark reality of a society that didn't know how to accept their difference. The tropical fruits and crops they had cultivated for generations, pineapples, bananas, yams, and cocoa, couldn't survive in this new land. And the soil they were given to farm on was rocky and poor, making agriculture nearly impossible. Beyond the struggle to grow familiar crops, the Maroons also faced significant labor exploitation. Instead of the freedom they had fought for in Jamaica, they were forced to work on manual labor projects for the British. They were assigned to build the third fortification of the Citadel in Halifax, and to work on the construction of Government House. The Halifax Citadel was not a new endeavor. It was a restoration and expansion of the fortress originally built in 1749. By the time the Maroons arrived, the Citadel had fallen into disrepair, and Halifax was increasingly vulnerable. With the growing fear of a potential French attack, the British authorities were in desperate need of labor to fortify the city's defenses. Enter the Maroons. The Maroons were strategically placed near Halifax rather than within the city itself, and immediately put to work on the third iteration of the Citadel Hill Fortress. This was no ordinary construction. Their labor was essential to the British efforts to rebuild and strengthen Halifax's fortification. As part of their work, the Maroons performed crucial manual labor on the Citadel project, assisting in reinforcing the city's military defense at a time when Halifax was on edge about French aggression. This labor was not just for show. It was a pivotal part of maintaining Nova Scotia's military readiness during a time of heightened tension. They cleared woods for roads and engaged in various forms of manual labor. These tasks were grueling and unrelenting, and the Maroons felt the sting of being treated as little more than cheap laborers, exploited for the needs of the predominantly white population. Their settlement in Nova Scotia was part of a broader colonial strategy to deal with a perceived security threat in Jamaica following the Second Maroon War. They weren't granted any political autonomy. Instead, they were tasked with contributing to the colonial infrastructure that served a society they were increasingly alienated from. Their labor was compensated through funds provided by Jamaican authorities, a harsh reminder on how their forced relocation was more about managing their presence than granting them true freedom. The Maroons' experience in Nova Scotia was marked by cultural alienation. Lieutenant Governor Sir John Wentworth, J.G. Wentworth, 877. Wentworth attempted to impose his version of culture on them, even trying to convert them to Christianity. This push to assimilate clashed with the Maroons' deep-rooted cultural practices and spiritual beliefs. They had fought fiercely for their autonomy, yet now in this foreign land, and their identity was being challenged. Nova Scotia became a cold, inhospitable place where they were treated as outsiders, alienated from both the land and the people around them. Despite the profound hardships, the Maroons did not remain silent. They submitted several petitions to authorities in Nova Scotia and Britain. They asked for relocation to a land with a climate similar to Jamaica's, one that could support the crops they were accustomed to growing and a lifestyle they could better relate to. But the British response was indifferent, and their pleas were largely ignored. By 1800, just 4 years after their arrival, the disillusionment was so great that 551 Maroons voluntarily chose to leave Nova Scotia and relocate to Sierra Leone. The British had promised them freedom, but the reality of life in Nova Scotia had been a stark contrast to those promises. In Nova Scotia, the Maroons faced the grim reality of being treated as a source of cheap labor. They were isolated, alienated, and marginalized, forced to live in a foreign land under conditions that they'd never imagined. As they left for Sierra Leone, they carried with them the weight of a broken promise and a desire for a place where they could once again live with the freedom and respect they had fought for so long to preserve. Their time in Nova Scotia was a tale of survival. It was a story of cultural resistance, of people fighting to retain their identity in the face of overwhelming odds. In Sierra Leone, they sought not just a new home, but the chance to rebuild their lives and continue the legacy of self-determination they had carried from the hills of Jamaica. The Maroons' journey was far from over, but their fight for freedom had never been more crucial. Imagine the disillusionment, the bitter cold of Nova Scotia. Granted, with this polar vortex, you might not have to imagine the cold of Nova Scotia. Imagine coming from a warm place like Jamaica and getting the cold that you have now. But even worse, many Maroons struggled to adapt, but others, just like their ancestors, adapted by forming strong communities, keeping their African traditions alive, and even passing down the knowledge of their survival techniques. They fought to hold on to their identity, much like the Ainu people in Golden Kamuy, who resist colonial forces by staying true to their roots. The Maroons' forced relocation to Nova Scotia, though filled with hardship, paved the way for a lasting cultural presence that endures to this day. While many Maroons eventually made their way to Sierra Leone, others chose to remain in Nova Scotia, integrating into the broader Black Nova Scotian community. Their resilience and autonomy and ability to adapt to a completely foreign environment helped shape the collective identity of Black communities in the region. Their resilience, autonomy, and ability to adapt to a completely foreign environment helped shape the collective identity of Black communities in the region. Maroon descendants in Nova Scotia continue to honor their African heritage and Maroon roots, preserving ancestral traditions, customs, and languages that connect them to their past. Beyond cultural preservation, the Maroons made significant contributions to Nova Scotia's history through their labor on major construction projects. Despite being exploited as cheap labor, They played a key role in building Halifax's Citadel and Government House. Today's Citadel Hill stands as a historical landmark, symbolizing not only the British colonial military strategy, but also the Maroons' significant contribution to the region's infrastructure. This legacy is recognized by historians and cultural institutions, underscoring the Maroons' important role in shaping Nova Scotia's development. Today, the descendants of the Maroons, especially in communities like Preston and North Preston, continue to celebrate their rich heritage through cultural events and traditions that honor their unique history. These events keep their ancestral connections alive and highlight the Maroons' broader contributions to Nova Scotia's culture and society. The Maroons fight to preserve their heritage, whether in Nova Scotia, Jamaica, or Sierra Leone, serves as a powerful reminder that their enduring legacy and the ongoing effort to remember that their story is remembered and respected. Ultimately, the Maroons' legacy in Nova Scotia is one of survival, resistance, and adaptation. Despite being forcibly relocated and subjected to harsh conditions, the Maroons left an indelible mark on the province's cultural and physical landscape. Their contributions to the infrastructure, as well as their enduring influence on the region's diverse population, continue to inspire ongoing efforts in cultural preservation, recognition, and social justice, both in Nova Scotia and beyond. Alright y'all, that's it. Thank you for joining. I hope you learned something. If you like this episode, please drop a like, comment, and consider following the podcast for more of your favorite anime-infused Black history. Until next time, peace.